Hello, everyone. My name is Gracie Ramon, and this is my presentation on solitary confinement and human behavior, and more specifically, how solitary confinement can have effects on human behavior. Okay, so what exactly is solitary confinement? Solitary confinement is defined as the physical isolation of individuals in their cells for 22 to 23 hours a day. Inmates, those who are placed in solitary confinement, are expected to eat, sleep, and even use the bathroom within their 6x9 cells. Usually 6x9 is the size of their cells. They have limited stimuli and hardly ever interact with those out in the outside population. They are only given 1 to 2 hours of outside time to see the outdoors, but even then they are isolated from the general population and have little to no contact with the outside world. Usually those who are recovering from solitary confinement have a hard time socializing with outsiders or people in general. Excuse me, my light just turned off. Okay, so why is solitary confinement used? There are a multitude of reasons why solitary confinement is used in the prison system. Violent and non-violent misbehaviors. So these includes any sort of infractions that a prisoner might commit. So they include fights between inmates. It also includes non-violent misbehaviors, which are things like having illegal contraband on them, so things like drugs or weapons. Those who are caught with those things will also be placed in solitary confinement as a form of discipline or punishment. However, in most cases, nonviolent misbehaviors are the main reason as to why people are placed in solitary confinement. Another reason why solitary confinement is used is to manage vulnerable populations. What does that mean? So in prison, managing vulnerable populations includes pedophiles, child murderers, child abusers, or those who are commonly disliked in prison. In order to keep them safe for the general population, they are placed in solitary confinement. Similarly, those who pose a great risk to the safety of those in general population will be placed in solitary confinement in order to keep others safe. So, and by managing vulnerable populations, it is meant to keep either an individual safe from the general population or to keep the general population safe from that individual. Okay, so how does solitary confinement affect human behavior? Now, it has detrimental effects on mental health and physical health. And even though I know physical health doesn't include human behavior, they kind of go hand in hand, because if your physical health is negatively affected, that can have an impact on your mental health. So I thought I would include the symptoms of both mental health and physical health that the solitary confinement can have. Okay, so some, not all, effects of solitary confinement on mental health. Some of the symptoms can include stress, anxiety, depression, feelings of hopelessness, anger, irritability, hostility. Can also include panic attacks. It can worsen pre-existing mental health issues, hypersensitivity to sounds and smells, problems with attention, concentration, and memory, hallucinations that affect all senses, paranoia, poor impulse control, social withdrawal. Like I mentioned earlier, they have a hard time interacting with those once they are released from solitary confinement. They have outbursts of violence. They don't know how to control themselves. Psychosis, so like they have a mental breakdown. They experience bouts of like paranoia and hallucinations, fear of death, and often what will often lead to it is self-harm or suicide. So that is the most serious of the symptoms of solitary confinement, or the side effects of being placed in solitary confinement. These people are handed all these horrible things to deal with, and oftentimes aren't given the proper equipment to cope with solitary confinement. So they struggle with a series of mental health issues, and oftentimes that can lead to suicide and depression. And like I mentioned a second ago, mental health and physical health do go hand in hand. So if someone is doing physically bad, they will likely often be doing mentally bad. So even though physical health doesn't directly affect human behavior, I thought it would be important to include in my presentation, seeing as physical health and mental health do go hand in hand. So just a few of the symptoms that that are resulted from solitary confinement and affect physical health include chronic headaches, eyesight deterioration, digestive problems, dizziness, excessive sweating, fatigue and lethargy, heart palpitations, shaking hands, weight loss, and the most serious of them can be diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. All things that you really wouldn't expect to come out of solitary confinement, but being restrained within a small cell for sometimes even years at a time can deteriorate your health, and that in turn will affect your mental health, and all in all will have terrible effects on you as a person or on inmates. Okay, so a perfect example of solitary confinement, or like of the effects of solitary confinement, is Albert Woodfox, a former Black Panther in Angola, Louisiana. He was falsely convicted for murder many years ago and was released 44 years later, having spent all 44 years in solitary confinement. On the left, on the bottom, you can see him as a young man in prison right next to his cell. Throughout his 44 years, he was placed in solitary confinement and is the longest serving solitary confinement prisoner in the United States. Even now, having been released in 2006 on his 69th birthday, even now he still suffers with bouts of claustrophobia and oftentimes wakes up believing he is trapped in a cell and he has to try to escape. He is now a spokesperson who speaks out against solitary confinement and an advocate for better treatment of the inmates in prison. Okay, so here are some on solitary confinement. All of these are from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They are all from the years 2011 and 2012. And they basically state that 10% of all prison inmates and 5% of jail inmates have spent 30 days or more in restrictive housing. Restrictive housing is just another term for solitary confinement. They're one and the same. Another statistic is that 30% of prison inmates and 22% of jail inmates who have been placed in solitary confinement often struggle with serious psychological distress, SPD, after having lived in solitary confinement. And those prisons with solitary confinement or restrictive housing, there is oftentimes lower trust between inmates and staff. They have more dangerous inmates, and they have oftentimes inmates with lengthier criminal records. So it just goes to show that there really is no positive outcome of solitary confinement. It can only have negative effects on those who are placed in it. Also, based on the second statistic, the one in the middle, those who spent time in solitary confinement, the length of solitary confinement did not have a determining effect on whether or not they would have serious psychological distress, SPD. The amount of time they spent in solitary confinement didn't determine whether or not they would have it. It just depends on the person. Okay, so here's some statistics. Here's some more statistics and facts on solitary confinement. On the left, there's a graph on the increased risks of those who are faced with solitary confinement in prison. So on the left, you have the smaller graph that it shows statistics of prison inmates who commit suicide, homicide, or overdose on drugs. However, they have not been faced with solitary confinement. And on the right, you have a higher percentage of those who have been in solitary confinement. Those who have been placed in solitary confinement are more likely to commit suicide, homicide, and drug overdose. Even though the percentage of those in solitary confinement is much, much less than those in general population or those placed in prison normally, the percentage, the rate of all these things is so much higher. Compared to all prison inmates, only 6 or 8% of them are placed into solitary confinement. And this is a statistic comparing that. I remember reading a case about a prison inmate who was only serving about 8 months in prison, and how somehow out of those 8, For 3 months, he had been placed in solitary confinement, and he ended up committing suicide after having been released. So, in the next fact or statistic, fact, the United Nations (UN) considers solitary confinement for the length of more than 15 days to be psychological torture. This does not mean that all states or all countries follow these guidelines. It's just what the United Nations recommends. These are also known as the Mandela rules, which I will get more into in a minute. Okay, so criticisms. So UN's Mandela rules, named after Nelson Mandela, who I will speak more on in a second. He has played a large role in solitary confinement and speaking out against solitary confinement. So the Mandela rules kind of negate how prisoners should be treated around the world and how solitary confinement should be treated. Some of the rules include that disabled persons shall not be placed in solitary confinement, and as previously mentioned, that a sentence for longer than 15 days in solitary confinement is considered psychological torture. Despite this, the United States doesn't always follow these rules. In several states, prisoners can remain in solitary confinement for longer than 15 days. As you can see, Albert Woodfox was in prison for 44 years and only released in 2006, which is pretty recent. And even then, the majority of solitary confinement used is often seen in the United States. So while it might not seem like it, solitary confinement is extremely, extremely popular here in the US. So, who is Nelson Mandela? Nelson Mandela was a former president of South Africa. He died a few years ago, back in 2013 or 2012, and he was in prison for a long amount of time, lengthy amount of time, for a few years, and he was placed into solitary confinement. So to him, solitary confinement had a place in his heart because it was something important that he thought he should speak out about. So to him is the most forbidding aspect of prison time. There is no end and no beginning. There is no one's own mind. There's only one's own mind which can play tricks. He spearheaded multiple civil disobedience efforts in South Africa. He himself was held in prison there before he became president, and he is the one who the Mandela rules are named after in UN. So, in conclusion, solitary confinement has no pros, or little to no pros. It increases risk of anxiety, sadness, suicidal thoughts, suicide in itself. Physical health is also at risk. As previously mentioned, it can cause heart failure, heart disease. The expenses are incalculable. It breaks down the minds of people instead of promoting growth, which is what prison is really supposed to do. It's supposed to promote rehabilitation and help to integrate prison mates back into society, when in reality, solitary confinement does the opposite. It breaks down people's minds, their health, and as previously mentioned multiple times, people who are placed in solitary confinement also have extremely hard times reintegrating back in society because they don't know how to interact with people. And especially when they've been placed in solitary confinement for exceedingly long amounts of time. There is nowhere that you can find that it says that solitary confinement is recommended. It's only used for disciplinary action or to keep other. In very few instances is it acceptable, either to keep the general population safe or an individual safe is it acceptable. Hardly ever is it acceptable outside of those two realms. So, all in all, solitary confinement is terrible. It should be abolished. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Again, I'm Gracie Ramon, and my presentation was on solitary confinement and how that itself affects human behavior. And these are all of my references. Thank you so much.